Hi again then guys, and welcome to another installment of Pick of the Pack on Gran Turismo 6 in particular. And this is a series, for those who are maybe new to it, where we basically sift through all of the needless duplicates in the Gran Turismo franchise, and you can probably think of a couple of cars which fall under that category. Skylines, MX-5s, NSXs, S2000s, and many of those we've already discussed. Some of them are less obvious, like the Mitsubishi GTO or the 300ZX, but they are still guilty of that. And of course the biggest culprit is the Skyline. There are so many Skylines, it's always been a joke in the franchise, but Gran Turismo 6 is kind of the pinnacle of that as far as the modern GT games go. So, in this particular video, we're discussing what's most likely going to be the last GT-R which we will talk about. We already covered the R32 and the R33, and there's no real need to cover the R35 because A, there aren't that many of them on the game, and B, they are genuinely unique. The Spec V, the Black Edition, the Nismo, they are different cars, and they do have different merits. So they don't really fall under that same category. However, these ones do. The R34 in particular is probably one of the cars which many people think of first when you think of having too many Skylines, because there are more R34s than there are 33s or 32s. So, as we always do, we'll break it down by year and then consider all of the versions of the car, non-racing and no aftermarket versions, only the ones from the Nissan dealership, which you can get, and then narrow down the ones which are actually worth buying. And kicking us off, first of all, we of course have 1999. This is the oldest generation of R34 in the game, and we have four different versions. You've got the standard GT-R, the V Spec, the V Spec N1, and of course the notorious Midnight Purple 2 version. So how do they compare? Which ones are worth buying? Which ones are overrated? Which ones are just plain useless? Well, all of the R34s are fast. The minimum power of all of these is 884 horsepower. That's the least powerful in this entire video. So when that's your starting point, that's pretty good. And of course it spans all the way up to over 960 in the case of the newer ones, one in particular. However, it's interesting to see how much these first year versions change. The torque in particular varies quite a lot. Almost 100 pound-feet separates the highest from the lowest. So what are the highlights? Well, the overall highlight for me is definitely the Spec V. It has the highest power and the highest torque. Although it's not the best in every way, it's a strong all-rounder because it has more power and torque than the GT-R or the Midnight Purple versions, but it's also cheaper than the N1. The N1 is also a good car, but the Spec V overall is probably the one which I would say is the best, if you want to look at it that way. However, it is interesting to note that both the normal GT-R and the Midnight Purple version of this year, 1999, are the cheapest of all of the R34s. They're both exactly the same, just under 50 grand, and in fact they're the only ones in this entire video to be under 50 grand. So that's interesting to note. And also the standard GT-R is the lightest of all of these, and also, alongside the GT-R from the next year, the year 2000, the lightest of them all, at 1232 kilos for both 99 and 2000. So overall, there are a couple which are worth a look. The Midnight Purple is useless, I would say, unless you specifically want it, because not only is it just a different colour, but it's actually, as you can see from the specs, a worse car. It weighs more than many of them, it has a much lower horsepower per tonne, a lot less power, and a whole lot less torque. So it's just not as good, which is kind of weird, but that's the way it is. So overall, I would say that of this generation, I would probably just go for the normal GT-R. It just keeps it simple, it's got a good price, and although it's not the most powerful, it's pretty good. Next up, of course, we have the year 2000, and as I mentioned just now, the GT-R of this year, the standard GT-R that is, shares the same advantage of the previous year in that it's the lightest. 1232 kilos is pretty good. That's a lot lighter than some others, a little bit lighter than others, depending on the model. Now, as far as this year goes, you've got four models again, and they actually span the exact same variants. You've got the GT-R, the Midnight Purple, the Spec V, and of course the N1, but the difference is that it's the V Spec 2 and the V Spec 2 N1. So how does it compare? Well, all of the prices are higher, which is what you'd expect to happen, but when you actually compare the different models to their previous versions, they don't vary a massive amount, and when they do vary, it tends to be kind of similar, and in some cases actually worse. If you compare this GT-R to the previous year, the price is a little bit higher, but not by much, but it has the same power, the same torque, the same weight, but it does have a slightly higher PP level, 646 compared to 642. So that's an advantage if you want to look at it that way, but not really. Because in effect that means the older one's better. If it has the same spec at a lower level, that's a better car. What about the Midnight Purple? Well, the Midnight Purple of the previous year was a pretty weak car. This one is exactly the same. In fact, even the PP level hasn't changed. It's still 633, so unless you like that colour, just avoid it. And at the end of the day, you could just buy it to get the colour, and then slap the colour on another car instead, if you really love it that much. I don't think most people do, though. I know there are some who do, but for most of us it's kind of irrelevant. What about the V Spec? Because now you're getting into more exciting territory. Well, the V Spec has 890 horsepower for this year. That's a huge drop, because the previous one had 955 and 840 pound-feet of torque, to this one's 787. So categorically, this car is worse than the prior year. So if you're going to go for an older spec V, go for the 99 model. It's a far better car. And as far as the N1 goes, well, weirdly enough, it's the same again. It gets worse instead of better. The power drops from 953 to 884, a huge drop, and the torque also drops, but not by as much. Well, it's a lot, but it's not as much as the power deficit, 812 down to 758. So, pretty bad drops, plus it weighs 5 kilos more, so there's really no advantage to either of the Spec Vs from this year. So overall, if you want the newer GT-R, then you could get it, but I would say that the year 2000 models, all 4 of them in fact, are completely pointless. You can literally miss out all of these, and you're not really missing out on anything at all. What then about the most interesting year of all, 2001? Well, the reason why I say 2001 is the most interesting year is because it's the only year of the R34 which only has one car in it, and that's, strangely, the M Spec. And this is the only M Spec of the entire list. There is an M Spec NER from the next year, but this is the only pure M Spec model. So how does it compare? Well, actually, it compares really well. The power is high, over 960 horsepower. The torque is high. In fact, it's highest of all so far in both power and torque. The weight is pretty good. It's the same as some of the Spec Vs, for instance, so that's not too bad. But the pricing is also quite good. It is a little bit cheaper, for instance, than the N1s. So, funnily enough, I would actually say that this M Spec is an interesting one to keep your eye on. It's not necessarily a car that I would recommend, but it definitely has some interesting advantages to its name. And the horsepower per tonne is also the highest of all of them so far, at 770. That's only one more than the N1, but still, it's more nonetheless. What then about the final year, which of course brings us the car that most people go for? Well, 2002 brings us 2 vehicles, so a little bit of an increase over 2001, but still a lot less than the 2 prior years before that, and of course, most significantly, it gives us the premium, the V Spec 2 NER, and interestingly, another M Spec, the M Spec NER, which, for some strange reason, is the most expensive of them all. 63,000 credits is even more than the premium, but, as you can see from the numbers, it's actually better than the premium in one specific way. It's not really that significant, but it is better, and that's the PP level. In fact, this version, the 2002 M Spec NER, has the highest PP level of all of the R34s. Of course, non-racing ones, 649, which isn't much higher, it has to be said. It's only one more, but still, it's more, so some people would probably like to know that. As far as the rest though, of course, the premium version has the advantage. It's cheaper than the M Spec, it has more power, more torque, it's lighter, and consequently the horsepower per tonne is better as well. So of course, the premium is the obvious choice, but the M Spec from this year is an interesting one, even if it's purely just for the PP level. So overall, which ones are actually worth getting? I would say that there are 3 cars in particular that are worth looking at, and they are the original 1999 standard GT-R, because it's the cheapest of them all, but has way better numbers than the Midnight Purple equivalent. So that one's interesting, because it's the birth of the R34, and I know that superfans will appreciate that. For the year 2000, completely avoid them. They are totally useless, they're more expensive than the previous year, but worse, so there's really no need. Then, though, for 2001, you do get the interesting M Spec, and that is a very interesting car, because I would say that the handling on that one in particular has an interesting twist compared to the previous ones. The GTRs are fairly neutral, the V Specs and the N1s are sharper, as you'd hope they would be through corners. The M Spec is almost like a mix of both. It has smooth handling, it's very forgiving, but it definitely feels faster than the normal GTR. So that's one to keep your eye on, and it's also one of the most unique. Overall, it's the only one of the year. But, of course, overall, if you're only going to go for one, go for the premium. It's the obvious choice to go for, it's the one which everyone would tell you to go for, it's the one which you probably typed down below before even watching the video. Because as always, it is the obvious choice to go for, so the 3 in particular, in summary, are the 99 GT-R, the 2001 M Spec for something different, and of course, overall, the premium, because although the premium is not the strongest in every way, it's the strongest overall, you could say. Plus, of course, it has the huge advantage of better graphics and better visual upgrades. Interestingly, though, and this really is surprising to me given how much respect Gran Turismo gives to the R34, there is no flat floor option. That is very interesting, because the R32 and the R33, and of course, some of the R35s do have that. There is not a single R34 in the entire game that you can fit a flat floor to. Very interesting. Strange choice of them to do that, but that's the way it is. I'd be very interested to see as well how high the PP could be if you were allowed to fit that. I would suspect somewhere around maybe 665, 670, something like that. But overall, most of them are completely pointless, I would say, the year 2000 in particular, and of course I hope that you find this list beneficial to figure out which ones you want to buy, which ones you want to try, or which ones just to have for the sake of a collection. So, of course, I'll see you guys next time. If you want to check out others like the NSX and the RX-7 in this series, click through to see those at the end of this video. But for now, as always, thanks for watching.